if you're like most people I know, you would like to save money on taxes. And if you're in those retirement years, there's actually a lot of opportunity to do just that. But you have to have a tax plan in place, because if you don't, you could end up paying tens of thousands of dollars in taxes that you didn't necessarily need to pay. So today we're going to go over the 3 tax rules that you should know if you want to try to keep a little bit more money in your pocket versus the IRS. Hello, my name is Jason Byans. I'm a former analyst and certified financial planner, and I want to share some helpful insights with you to try to make this complex world of retirement planning a little more simple and sensical. And whenever we're talking about tax rules and trying to save money, I can't help but think of Grant. Grant worked for one of those big box retailers, a big name that you would know if I mentioned it. And he worked for a lot of years for them. And when he retired, he had a good pension. So he had his income, and then he had Social Security. But then he also had some savings, some non-retirement account savings. And he had a lot in his 401k as well, which eventually became an IRA. So Grant did what most people do, and I can't blame him. He went out and he enjoyed it. He bought the boat. He went on that trip. He blessed the people around him. Eventually, Grant and I met, and when we were going over, what had happened over the last roughly about a year, we realized that I had to be the bearer of bad news. Because if Grant would have done just a little bit of tax planning, he could have done all of the things that he wanted to do and would have saved a lot of money in terms of taxes. So let's jump right in terms of the 3 tax rules. So tax rule number 1 is you want to know your tax buckets, okay? So you have different types of investment accounts, and the IRS looks at them in 3 different buckets. And so they kind of look at them through certain lenses, and we want to look at your money through those same lenses. We want to look at your money the same way that the IRS looks at your money, because they write the rules and they take the taxes, right? So if we're going to plan a strategy, we have to play by their rules. So the first bucket is called the tax-deferred bucket. And you've probably heard of the tax-deferred bucket before. It's typically when we're talking about retirement accounts. And some examples could be, if you work for a big company and you had a 401k, or maybe you have an IRA, maybe you work for a church or a government entity or a charity or whatnot, you may have a 403b. So these are examples of tax-deferred accounts. What does that mean? It means that you earned income, while you were working, you put it into this retirement account, but you didn't pay taxes on it. You put it in there, it grew and grew and grew, and whenever you take money out, then you're going to have to pay taxes. You're deferring the taxes, okay? And then we have the next bucket, the taxable bucket. And so some examples of this, this could be real estate, but if we're going to think about more investment accounts and retirement planning, this can be a non-qualified brokerage account. What do I mean by non-qualified brokerage? Well, let's just say you have money that's invested in the stock market that's not in an IRA or a 401k. That would be a non-qualified brokerage account. And these can have other names that may make a little bit more sense. If you have a joint account with a husband and wife, if you have a trust account, if you have an individual account. Okay, just that it's not an IRA, but it is invested in this. You could also have this in a savings. It could be in a CD at a bank, okay? Any non-retirement account, that's a taxable account, okay? And then we have the coveted tax-free account. And this is where everybody wants to be, right? And what are some examples in terms of accounts that would fall into that bucket, the tax-free bucket? Well, the most common is the Roth account, all right? And then what else do we have? We can have munis, so muni bonds, municipal bonds. We could also have different types of life insurance. Those can fall into the tax-free bucket. So that's tax rule number 1, is we want to understand the tax buckets. So you could almost go through all of your investments and you could categorize them into these 3 buckets, all right? So that's step 1. So your tax buckets are very important to know. And so are many other concepts whenever we're talking about retirement planning. So I want to encourage you to click the link below, and we'll send you a copy of Designed to Last. It was a book written by my brother that is really geared toward retirees in this phase of life. And it has really kind of three great aspects to it. Number one is it's only about 100 pages. It's a pretty short book. Number two, it takes these concepts that can sometimes be complicated and hard to understand, and Justin does a great job of boiling them down to simple analogies. And then lastly, in the back of the book, there's a list of questions. These are the right questions you want to be asking as a retiree. So click the link below and be happy to send you that book. We're talking about taxes. So rule number 2 is, what's your tax rate? Once we know which one falls in which bucket, what are the tax rates for each of these? So if you take money out of your tax-deferred bucket, it is going to hit your ordinary income tax rates. Okay, your ordinary income tax rates. What do I mean by that? Well, we in the United States have a progressive tax scale. So some of it may be taxed at 10%, and then 12%, and then 22%, 24%, etc. Okay? So if you take anything from your tax-deferred account, and this is also assuming it's after your age 59 and a half, there's stipulations there so you don't get an early withdrawal penalty. But if you're, say, 60-something years old, and you take money from a tax-deferred account, it's going to look like salary and wages. It's going to hit your ordinary income tax rates, okay? So understanding rule number 2 is understanding tax rates. Well, what about if we take money from our taxable account? Well, that's going to hit capital gains tax rates. So capital gains tax rates fall into one of 3 rates. You're either going to pay 0%, 15%, or 20%, okay? How much you pay in terms of capital gains is determined by how much of all of your income, okay? So it's a little bit larger calculation there. So again, your capital gains tax rates, if you take those out, they don't hit your ordinary income tax rates. Depending on what your total income is, you may be taxed at 0%, you may be taxed at 15%, or you may be taxed at 20%, all right? So moving on with rule number 2 of know your tax rate, it seems kind of, self-explanatory. Well, this is tax-free. Well, I do want to put a little asterisk here because it is generally tax-free. Okay, because it's very important with any of these types of accounts is we want to make sure that we adhere to the different specifications, parameters, guidelines that we have for these. So if we're talking about a Roth account, it can be tax-free, but you have to have it open for at least 5 years. You have to take the money out after you're 59 and a half. There's some other stipulations, but as long as you do go by the rules, it can be tax-free. With muni bonds, it depends on where you buy the muni bonds, okay? So if you're living in one state and you're buying a muni bond from another state, you may not get away from state income tax in that regard. So generally, they're tax-free if you're doing proper planning and understanding where you're buying those from. And then life insurance, as long as it's properly structured in the way that you take it out, it can be tax-free as well. So this is the coveted bucket. To try to get essentially as much of our assets as we can here, but we want to do it in a tax efficient manner. All right. So just to recap, remember rule number 1, understand your tax buckets. So where do your assets fall into? Rule number 2, understand what is the tax rates for each of those. Okay. Tax deferred, we're going to get hit with ordinary. Taxable, we're going to hit with capital gains. And then tax free, as long as we adhere to the guidelines, generally those are tax free. All right, so now we're going to move on to rule number 3. And that is you need to know your tax triggers. Okay, you need to know your tax triggers. And it kind of builds on everything else that we've been talking about, and it's the application of that. All right, so number 1 in terms of tax triggers is that ordinary income. And we said that, yeah, if you take out of a tax-deferred account, that hits your ordinary income. Well, what else hits that? You have salary or wages. Perhaps you have a part-time job. If you've got some non-qualified brokerage accounts, okay, you've got some money in a joint account maybe with your wife, and you've got dividend-paying stocks or you earn interest from bonds, that's going to hit your ordinary income tax rate, okay? So we need to take that into consideration because that is a tax trigger and that affects everything else that we're doing. So second is that capital gains. We need to understand capital gains, the capital gains that were coming out of the taxable bucket, because we can have short-term or we can have long-term capital gains. What do I mean by that? Well, if you buy a security, let's just say February 1st, and then you sell that same security just a couple months later in May. Well, if you sell it for a gain, that's a short-term capital gain. It actually is going to hit your ordinary income tax rates. But if you hold that same stock, let's just say for 5 years, you buy it in February of 2001 and you don't sell it till February of 2026, that's a long-term capital gains. That's going to hit this, our capital gains tax rate. And then the next tax trigger is Social Security. And this one's really, really important. Whenever we're doing tax planning, okay, Social Security can be taxed up to 85% of it. Okay, so what we need to take into consideration is something called provisional income. And we won't go through that in this video. But provisional income includes several of these other income streams, and that determines how much of your Social Security is taxable. So if you're not doing strategic tax planning, you could end up causing more of your Social Security to be taxable than you expected. And that's when you kind of get surprised there in April or May whenever you file your taxes. Like, oh man, well, we ended up triggering taxes that we may have not intended to do. And then a real prime example of that is something called IRMA. What is IRMA and why do we care about it? IRMA is an extra penalty that you would have to pay on your Medicare. So that Medicare Part B that you're paying every month, it could be more expensive if you trigger this. And you don't get any more access to doctors or services. You don't get any more, kind of perks or benefits. You're just paying more for the same thing. So those are the things we really want to focus on when we're talking about tax triggers, because we don't want to trigger additional taxes unnecessarily. So let's do a real quick recap of the 3 tax rules. Number 1, you want to understand, where do your investments fit? Which tax bucket are they in? All right. Then once we know that, we can say, okay, now we know the tax rate, that if I pull money out of these, what is the tax rate I'm going to pay on those? And then lastly, as we start to get into the strategy, as we start to figure out what is the plan that best suits you and your family, we want to be able to look at the tax triggers, okay? And of course, there's lots of software and calculations that we can do that really unpack this and make sure that we don't do these things, but we have to know about them. We have to be intentional. So as you can see, there's a lot going on in terms of taxes, but taxes isn't the only thing that we encounter in retirement. One of the biggest decisions that we encounter in retirement is Social Security. And I get asked a question a lot, should I take it early? Should I take it late? So if you want to click this video right here, we go over when you should consider, or the 7 good reasons of when you should consider taking your Social Security at age 62.